If you were a folk music fan in the 1970s in Britain, nothing compared to the ethereal sounds of John Martyn. Of all the live performances of John floating around on YouTube, perhaps none are as bewitching as the recorded instances of him playing his track Solid Air.
You were walking a line, living on solid air, taking your time, living on solid air. Well, I don't know what's going wrong in your mind. I can see that you just don't like what you find on solid air.
In the lore of English folk music fandom, the genesis of that song is well known by now. Over a woozy, jazz-influenced backing, John sings to his longtime friend Nick Drake in an effort to coax him from the depths of his despondency and depression, an increasingly heavy chainmail weighing down on Drake in the early 70s. John's valiant attempt to break through to his friend sadly went unheard, however. Within the space of a few short years of Solid Air being released, Nick Drake was dead, sadly taking his own life one unremarkable November morning in 1974. He himself would leave behind 3 extraordinary albums, a trio of records that continue to mesmerise fans today, standing as examples of superlative storytelling, arrangement and production. It's understandable then that because of its haunting, prescient nature, many focus disproportionately on the song Solid Air when assessing John Martyn's album of the same name, released in 1973. However, there's far more to that record than just that song alone. In this video, we're going to take a look at that John Martyn album, 1973's Solid Air, a record in which John pulled away from the folk tradition he had found himself increasingly boxed in by. On this album, he looked toward more modern, transatlantic influences as he tried to find a new vessel for his increasingly conflicting emotions arising from his changing personal circumstances. And perhaps by the time this album was released, an entirely new, different songwriter emerged, one that was able to plumb the depths of his stormy emotions to write songs as classic as Solid Air, but also one whose increasingly dangerous and erratic temperament would later threaten his own career. But first, a quick plug. This channel is brand new, so I'd love it if you could take the time to hit that like and subscribe button, and maybe drop a comment below on what you think of the video and the album more generally once you've finished watching. Thanks for your support, and now, back to John Martyn. By 1972, John Martyn was an established name in the British folk scene. Starting out under his original birth name, Ian McGeechy, he had, at a young age, mastered the acoustic guitar, inspired to pick up the instrument when he saw a young Joan Baez fingerpicking in an early televised BBC live recording.
All men are false, says my mother. They'll tell you wicked, loving lies.
The young troubadour was also entranced by the virtuosic stylings of Davy Graham, one of the shining luminaries of the 1960s British folk revivalist movement.
I love my lover well, she knows. I love the ground on where she goes.
McGeechy soon jettisoned his Christian name, adopting the nom de plume John Martyn, supposedly naming himself after the legendary brand emblazoned on his guitar's headstock. John left his native roots behind in Scotland and made a permanent move to London in an attempt to entrench his new pseudonym in the capital by headlining folk clubs like The Cousins, a dingy but formative basement outpost on Soho's Greek Street. A recording deal and a set of early albums soon followed. On his 1967 debut, John wrote songs that told of longings of the head and the heart, a fertile and fashionable topic in a decade that had seen increasing divides through anti-war protests and civil rights struggles across the world.
And though you say you'll journey to some foreign land, I'll remember you. Yes, and I'll be true to your memory.
In In 1968, John met singer and single mother Beverly Kuttner at the Chelsea College of Art. The two fell in love and married quickly, before going on to release 2 albums together as John and Beverly Martyn. On this pair of albums, the newly married couple would harmonise together on songs that dwelled on themes like love and domesticity. Occasionally, they would overtly demonstrate more psychedelic influences, with songs that leaned on more fantastical imagery.
Traffic like a lady, turning your eyes, amber, green and red surprise. Traffic like a lady, turning your eyes. Traffic like a lady, turning your eyes on me.
However, elsewhere on his solo albums, John would sing about his misgivings toward his relationship, both his need to demonstrate his love for his partner, but perhaps also feeling unable to give everything to their relationship in case he was rejected or humiliated.
Laying down the ways to say I need you, scared of looking tall and feeling small, running through the days I have decided, scared of being wrong, and that's it all.
Both John's solo albums and his recordings with Beverly Martyn were well received, but none had particularly changed John's standing in the scene in the way that he had hoped for. He increasingly felt trapped in by his partnership with Beverly, both personally and professionally.
Ireland didn't want to continue with the duo. They wanted me, but they didn't want Beverly. And I had, by that time I had my adopted child Wesley, and also my Vari Dinks was on the way, so I had to make money. And that was the only way I could do it, was do a solo career, go back to where I started almost, and pursue the solo career.
At the same time, by the early 1970s, John was increasingly bored by the folk scene, turning toward more unexpected influences to keep his creative spirit alive. The American free jazz innovator Pharoah Sanders was especially inspiring for John, particularly his 1969 album, Karma. On that record, John was especially inspired by the way Sanders was able to tell the story of turmoil through the emotive sound of his saxophone, set against the exciting, shape-shifting backing of African percussion. As John commented in an interview later in his career on the influence of Sanders on his music. With Sanders it was different, beautiful long notes but with breath and gurgling in between. His tone blew my mind and he gave me a glimpse through a keyhole that I didn't even know existed. Turning to unconventional influences like Sanders would be an important development in John's approach to his own music. Indeed, when it came to recording his next album, John would lean heavily on this karmic, cosmic sound to determine his own new direction. For the Solid Air sessions, John collected around him a set of musicians and collaborators that would help breathe new air into his demos and push his own playing to new outer limits. John was not new to working with distinguished collaborators. On his previous album Stormbringer, John had worked with Levon Helm, drummer and vocalist of the band, and Billy Monday, who had played with Frank Zappa, and he increasingly took inspiration from the sonic interplay and spontaneity of in-studio jamming. So, for the drums on this record, John enlisted Dave Mattox, who had drummed briefly with Fairport Convention, as well as on Nick Drake's second album, Brighter Later. John Rabbit Bundrick was tapped to take up the keyboards on Solid Air. He had played with Fairport Convention singer Sandy Denny on one of her solo albums, as well as with the band Free on their album Heartbreaker.
$3 a share. $3 a share.
Perhaps most important was John once again enlisting Danny Thompson of legendary folk rock band Pentangle to play the upright bass on the record. John had played with Danny sporadically during the early 1970s, including Danny featuring on John's previous album Bless the Weather. Danny's dexterous, sultry bass lines seemed to loosen John up and add a new layer of depth to his live playing. As John said himself in an interview, "I'm trying to get freer and less structured, and Danny's the only cat I've found so far who can follow. I tend to play lead and rhythm and bass all together because of my background of solo experience in folk clubs, and musicians seem to find that hard to get into. Danny does it like second nature, and it's been a gas to work with him." Inspired by his jams with Danny, John hoped to take his playing to the next level with his new band. He asked the collected musicians around him to keep an open-hearted attitude toward the music and to play as freely as they could. John would begin a song, and then in the room, the musicians would chime in when they had a musical part in their head, but improvisation and instinct were the key drivers behind the sound of the record. As Bundrick himself said, "John's sessions were like really long and extensive jams. When I was in Free, we would learn the track before we would record. With John, everybody would get to their instruments, and we'd start playing. We'd just all join in, until all this stuff just started to gel. He didn't ask anyone to play a certain thing." Most of the album was recorded in November of 1972, with John Wood behind the mixing desk. Wood had engineered on all of Nick Drake's albums, and was by now one of the country's most sought-out producers. The sessions were recorded at two separate studios, firstly at Sound Techniques, a small independent recording studio in Chelsea, and in Basing Street Studios down the road in Notting Hill. Basing Street Studios, which was owned and operated by Island Records, became the engine room for many important albums of the 1970s. Black Sabbath, Traffic and Mott the Hoople had all recorded here, and so had Bob Marley when he recorded parts of his 1973 album Catch a Fire here. If John approached the assembly of his team with easy confidence for the recording of the album, his actual lyrics on the record reveal a more conflicted, uncertain temperament, underscored by changes in John's personal life. By this time, John and his wife Beverly had moved from London to the seaside town of Hastings, together with Beverly's son Wesley, her child from a previous relationship. On the outside, their marriage seemed rosy, but the embers of jealousy that would go on to become a great blazing fire in John's personality were starting to show. He had already hit out at Beverly for her previous relationship with the celebrated folk singer Bert Jansch, and after their two jointly released albums, he began to purposefully marginalise his wife's career, seeing himself as the more promising musical talent, and thinking Beverly was holding him back. Soon enough in time, his attacks on Beverly would become physically violent. Much of John's fitful anger came from his frustrations and conflicted view of his circumstances. John was hardly 25 when the album was being recorded, and he increasingly began to see his marriage as a domesticating shackle, a leash on the freedom he felt owed to him as a young man on the precipice of making it big in his field. In the song The Man in the Station, John sings of a character about to take a train journey, homeward bound to his family, but mulling on the contrary sentiments he feels about his relationship.
There's a man in the station, the train in the rain. There's a vase in the mirror that's showing the stream. There's a woman in the dark that's standing apart. There's a love in the man that's breaking his heart, but it's alright. I'm catching the next train home.
That same theme, feeling the pull between domestic happiness and the romance and hedonism of the open road, is further explored in the song Over the Hill. The hill in the song's title is in fact based on the real rolling countryside that John's train home from London would snake through as it made its way to Hastings, a journey John often took when commuting home after working late in the studio. In the song, John lays bare the skittish anxieties that would haunt him on the train home, his deep-seated fear of commitment, and his hedonistic tendencies that increasingly saw him overindulging recreationally with alcohol and drugs.
Can't get enough of sweet cocaine, get enough of a Mary Jane. Going back to where I've gone wrong, going rolling back home again over the hill. Hey, 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 over the hill.
But at the same time, John would explore feelings of deep love elsewhere on the record. On the song Go Down Easy, John taps into naturalistic imagery as a fitting metaphor for the sensuality and mutual dependency he and Beverly were feeling at the time.
Girl around me like a fern in the spring. Lie down here, let me sing the things you bring and we can go down easy.
And then on Don't Want to Know, against the sound of a gossamer, tremolo-soaked electric piano, John repeats a single motif about his want to let only love into his life.
And I don't want to know about evil, only want to know about love. I don't want to know about evil, I only want to know about love.
The picture that emerges is complex, a man deeply divided and pulled in different directions. On the one hand, he was struggling with the responsibilities and resulting restrictions that came from his marriage, and yet at the same time he recognised his increasing reliance on Beverly. Perhaps the most accurate assessment was that John responded to his situation specifically in the moment he inhabited, and that his feelings therefore were always capricious, changeable and unpredictable from one day to the next. The singer Claire Hamill, who had an on-off romantic affair with John in the 1970s, said it best. He cared about his family deeply, but John was a very complex character. He had different compartments of his life. Being away from home, being away from his family. It must have hurt him, but I never saw that part of him. He was just in the moment. He was all about the gig and the music. He was obviously a hedonist, no doubt about it. That sense of impulsive ambiguity made its way into the song May You Never, which would perhaps go on to become John's most well-known song. John had originally recorded the song as a standalone single in November 1971 with a full band. The occasional flashes of brass and lengthy saxophone solo lend the original version an almost yacht rock feel.
You'll never lose your woman overnight.
However, John felt he could add a truer, stripped-down version of the song to Solid Air. When it came to recording the version that is known today, he only cut the final iteration at the last minute, recording the song the day before the final tapes were to be submitted to the label for mastering. As John Wood recalls, "We were mixing the night before I was getting on the plane to go to New York to master the album. We get to May You Never, and I don't know how many versions John had done of it. I think maybe we're going to use one that he'd already done. I can't remember. All I remember was him sort of going on and moaning about it and saying, 'Oh, I'm not sure.' And in the end I just said, 'For fuck's sake, just go and get your guitar out in the studio and go and do it.' And that's the version that's on the record. For good reason, May You Never has become a celebrated staple of British folk music of the 1970s. With just a tender, intricately finger-picked guitar pattern for backing, John sings sweetly, offering a forgiving shoulder and helping hand to the listener.
May you never lay your head down without a hand to hold. May you never make your bed out in the cold.
Though the tone of the song is sweet and almost childlike in its sentiment, there are glimpses of something darker in the song too. At instances, John sings of treacherous blades to be stabbed into one's back, and there are mentions of late-night barroom brawls.
May you never lose your temper if you get in a barroom fight. May you never lose your woman overnight.
Though it's up for debate, there is possibility John is in fact addressing himself in the song. At this point, John was known for his fiery temper, especially when he was hitting the road with Danny Thompson. The two would regularly end up in scuffles after gigs, not only with others but together too. John's temper would flare easily, his gregarious manner on stage quite different from his erratic personality off stage. The DJ and club promoter Jeff Dexter said of the song, "We were in the pub in Hastings one night and this guy said to him, 'Man, I love your wife, she's really beautiful.' John flew into a rage and was going to kill him, but I told him he had to control his temper. A few days later, John woke up Jeff in the middle of the night. John said, 'I've written this song about you.' Then he dragged me downstairs and played May You Never for me. You know that line about, 'May you never lose your temper if you get in a barroom fight'? That's where it came from." In the refrain of the song, John leans on the theme he explored before on Don't Want to Know and Go Down Easy, the power of love to heal and enlighten. fantastic, illuminating and balanced biography Small Hours, the music journalist Graham Thompson suggests that this lyric was an interpolation of Love Song by the singer-songwriter Leslie Duncan.
Love is the key we must turn. Truth is the flame we must burn. Freedom the lesson we must learn.
On this record, John was increasingly itching to get away from the conventional folk sound, trying to emulate the sound he was hearing in Pharoah Sanders' music and other avant-garde records. He experimented a lot with a tape delay effects unit called the Echoplex, saying in an interview, "The only reason I bought the Echoplex was to try and imitate Sanders' sustain on my guitar." That experimentation had made its way onto past recordings, such as on the instrumental track Glistening Glinderborn from John's previous album Bless the Weather. For the Solid Air recording sessions, on the track I'd Rather Be the Devil, John took an old Skip James song, which had a traditional fingerpicking sound, and then experimented with it, using slapback and delay to create a shimmering, reverberating wall of noise. But it was perhaps on Solid Air, the record's title track, that John stretched his sound to new jazz-influenced limits. At the song's centre is John's complex guitar line, backed by Danny Thompson's nimble-fingered bass fretwork, with occasional vibraphone flourishes lending the song a dreamy, slightly off-kilter feel. Vocally, John was once again taking inspiration from the sound of brassy jazz instruments. He was increasingly trying to change his singing style to become like an instrument itself, gently intoning and stretching his voice mellifluously between notes to create a softer, smokier feel. As John Rabbit Bundrick said of John's approach to singing on Solid Air, his voice was almost like a horn. He would smooth in his entries like a saxophone. It was almost like an actor's voice. The song is an ode to John's friend Nick Drake. John paints a picture of his friend bogged down by life, doggedly struggling through his day-to-day, as if the air itself is thick with conspiracy, sluggishly weighing him down. Despite his scrappy reputation, John seems to be in pain himself watching his friend struggle, saying at one point he thinks so much of his friend that he would follow him anywhere.
I know you, I love you, and I can be a friend, I can follow you in every way.
Despite his pleading, his friend's miserable suffering persists as he finds himself giving in to his internal anxieties and constant remonstrations.
Don't know what's going wrong in your mind, and I can tell you like what you find when you're moving through solid air, solid air.
John and Nick were like yin and yang. Whilst Nick was introverted, self-effacing and distinctly middle class, John came across garrulous, bawdy, coarse and hard as nails. Despite their contrasting styles, the two had a deep chemistry and understanding, to the point where John had sung about Drake on a previous album as well.
Oh, Sandy Gray, don't leave me just today. Don't think on the road you'll be going. Think of all the time and the days we've had to mind of the future. There's no way of knowing.
Though that song is a cover, originally sung by Robin Frederick, the inclusion of the recording by John on his debut album seemed to hint at his own sense of admiration of Drake, a constantly beguiling friend who was totally different to John himself. The singer Linda Thompson, part of the 1970s folk set in Britain, observed their relationship from afar. She said, "John was different from other people. He was very free. He wasn't at all uncomfortable or frightened of loving a man, not in a physical way, which was quite unusual in those days. Nick and John loved one another." John himself spoke about Nick Drake many years after his death. Here he is talking about his friend.
Do you think he could have been helped, that the end might not have happened as it did?
It's very easy to look back and think that oneself, you look at your own behaviour. I look at mine and think, well, perhaps I should have done more. And I think everyone who knew him felt exactly the same way, because he's an immensely lovable man, and a great loss and stuff. But no, I think he had his sights set, and that was that. I don't think it was. There was no gainsaying the man. Once he decided on his course of action, he just took it.
Yes, he was prepared not to go on much longer. Do you feel?
I think he was just. I think he found the place was just not quite good enough for him. In all honesty, and whereas a lot of people just harden themselves to the whole nonsense and say, well, right, the world isn't exactly perfect, but I get on with it. I think the weight of responsibility and social and I suppose in every other way just overpowered him. He didn't enjoy life much.
For the album's cover, John and his team settled on an image of heat-sensitive photography. John explained, "I met a guy who was doing that thing called heat-sensitive photography, and what we did was we blew a hairdryer against my hand and photographed it, so it gave some semblance of imagined solid air. The image seems to reveal clearly the ponderous weight of something that many cannot see with the naked eye alone, a fitting metaphor for the deep depression and sadness that would cling to Nick Drake and would later go on to claim his life at the young age of 26. Solid Air sold modestly, but in the decades that have followed, its place in musical history has grown significantly, with many calling it one of the key British releases from the early 1970s, alongside other records from the likes of Nick Drake, Cat Stevens, Deep Purple and David Bowie. Despite its enduring legacy, John Martyn himself seemed to marginalise the merits of the record later in his life. He began to resent the fact that he was bracketed as just a folk artist due to the latter-day success of the album.
Well, when I first started to play, the first 8 albums I made were, I suppose, based around acoustic guitar. And I think there's this terrible thing. People think that if you play acoustic guitar, then you're a folkie. And so I got saddled with that. I've never actually been a folk musician at all. Never once. And I wrote my own stuff, since I was like 17. And I never was ever. I know the old folk song, but I've picked them up by osmosis rather than anything else.
By the later stages of his career, John was defiantly incorporating electronic, dub and hip-hop styles into his records from the 80s and 90s. His innovation won him many admirers across multiple genres, and led to his inclusion as a guest vocalist on dance tracks that strayed a long way from his folk roots. John's constant inclination toward innovation and his stubborn disregard for genre perhaps started on Solid Air, an album where John mixed folk, soul, skiffle, jazz and electronic sounds, often in the same song. It made his sound unclubbable, frustratingly so for critics and some fans who wanted John to stay acoustic and to hang closer to his folk beginnings. That refusal to adhere to easy genre standards has led John to be embraced by new generations of fans, however, such as Ben Howard, an artist who has not shied away from talking about how much of an influence John Martyn was on his own music. That influence is clear when you listen to Ben Howard's own experiments with echo and delay, a sound that reached its highest peaks on Solid Air. Lyrically, Solid Air has songs that hint at the darker aspects of John's character, an uneasiness and itchiness in his familial and romantic relationships, a creeping envy and paranoia of those around him, and the alcohol and drug habits that he was increasingly drawn to. But there are also clear insights into the softer aspects of his personality too, the willingness to lay himself down to aid his tortured friend across choppy waters of the mind and soul, and his unrelenting desire to lead a life governed not by evil, but by love. These were all the contradictory forces that would go on to determine the future path of John Martyn, even if he did struggle to live up to the standards in life that he sang about. Danny Thompson, perhaps John's principal collaborator in his life, perhaps said it best when he reflected on his own musical career.
If John had been the only person I'd ever worked with and been associated with, that would have fulfilled all my musical demands, ambitions, loves, everything. Because there was highs and lows, and it was real. It was real. It wasn't to sell records. It wasn't anything like that. It was, here we are, bosh, get on that. bang, right or wrong, here we are.
For John's many admirers, Solid Air will remain one of his key records, an album in which natural musical chemistry, a conflicted and deeply honest approach to songwriting, and an utterly compelling musical talent make it an essential and uncompromising listen, a surefire modern classic. I'd love to hear what you think of this record and what John Martyn's music means to you. Drop a comment below on what you think of this record and where you think it ranks in John's back catalogue. Drop this video a like if you enjoyed it and hit subscribe too for more videos like this in the future. If you have any suggestions of what albums I should look at next, drop a comment below and I'll try and get round to it at some point in the future. Thanks for watching.